Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So today we're going to go through a spouse client file from start to finish, and it's going to be really open-ended. So if you have any questions, you can just jump in or you can unmute yourself or just send it through the Zoom chat, whatever's easiest. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. This is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system, and it's going to list all the different clients. So to add a new client, you just go up to the Add button, and the key things are first name and last name. The email field, this is there if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you'd put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire box, and then when you went to add them to the system, you'd be prompted with two options. You can either have the questionnaire sent directly from eState Planner, or you can copy a special link that you can send to the clients from your own email. So that way you can sort of personalize the email more. So once the client receives the link to the questionnaire, they're going to be prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure. And then they can go into it and enter in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they fill out in that online questionnaire is going to automatically populate back into your system. So it's going to save a lot of time for the manual entry. But you don't have to send the questionnaire. If you like to use your own sort of PDF or Word questionnaire that you send to the clients, or if you like to do it live in the client meeting with them, then you don't have to worry about putting their email in and don't click the use questionnaire box, and then there's not going to be a questionnaire sent. So since this is a spouse client file, we need to add both spouses as separate clients to the system. And this is going to ensure that they're linked together. And if it's a mirror will situation, it's going to allow us to easily sync the scenarios and appointments between the two. So we're going to go up to the add button to add the spouse. I'm going to call her Lauren Collins. And the key thing is when you're adding the second spouse to the system, you want to click on this spouse client field and pick the name of the first spouse. And you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse because the first spouse already needs to be in the system in order to select them from this drop-down list. So once this is done, this means that anything that's joint or designated, that's joint or any shared family tree information, it's going to automatically populate into both of their profiles. And you're also going to have the opportunity to sync the scenarios or appointments if it's a mirror will situation, like I mentioned before. Then you just have to decide who you want to start with. So I'm going to pick Ben, click on his name to go into his profile. And this is what you're going to be starting with. If you haven't sent the questionnaire, or if you have but the client hadn't filled it out yet, you start with the client and the spouse. And usually I like to enter the client's information first. So I double click on the client's little icon and it's going to bring up more details. So really the key things for anyone on the family tree are going to be first name, last name, and gender, just to make sure the wording of the will comes out properly. For the client specifically, this also known as field will populate, but not for anyone else on the family tree. It would just be for information. Date of birth, you can also type it in, June 8th, 1950. And the age will populate for you automatically. Country of birth, you can pick a country, you can do citizenships. Then all this other stuff is good for that information gathering to make sure you're having that adequate investigation into your client, but it's not going to affect the will generation itself. Then residency. Province is important because it's how the system knows how to calculate the probate tax throughout the system, but also how the system knows which precedents to generate when you're generating wills. So if you're from Nova Scotia or BC or Alberta, you're going to want to make sure to change the province to the correct province to make sure those precedents generate instead of the Ontario ones. The city field, it will also populate in the will. So from the city of Toronto, um, it'll come up on that first page in the will. Then special circumstances for the client. This is a place where you could note any potential capacity issues. So you would just check the box and then you could write in a further description below just to make sure that you got this stuff well documented in case there were to be a will challenge down the line. Then relationships, it's just going to tell you who the client's related to. Next, let's say we wanted to add a child. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So if I click on Ben, it's going to get the blue circle around him. And then I'll go up to the add button and pick child. And whenever you're adding a child, it's going to ask you who the other parent is. If it's the current spouse, if it's an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will, so you want to add them to the family tree, or if they're a single parent. So either they're genuinely a single parent, or there's an ex-spouse that is not in the picture, so they don't need to be added in. But we're going to say it's Lauren. And then we can type the child's information in. We'll say this is John Collins, date of birth, July 19th, 2000. And then special circumstances for anyone that's not the client. This is a place where you can sort of note relationship difficulties or estrangement to client so that in case there were a will challenge, you'd have this really well documented. But most importantly here is the disability box. So if this individual is disabled and you're going to be setting up a Henson Trust or something like that for them later on in the will, you're going to want to make sure the box, the disability box, is checked off here so the system can pick up on the fact that the individual is disabled and draft that special Henson Trust clause in the will. And then let's say we wanted to add a grandchild. So it all works through direct relationship. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben, click on the child's icon, and add a child to that child. And that's how you would get the grandchild's information in. So I'm going to call her Lily Collins, female. Same kind of thing with nieces and nephews. You would click on the client's icon, add a sibling to the client, click on the sibling's icon, add a child to the sibling. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree, you can go over to this All tab and add them in here. So it's going to list everyone you've added in, and you just go up to the Add button and then type in their information. So let's just say Jordy's going to be involved later on. And then it'll ask you the relationship. So Jordy's related to Ben, the client, and he is a friend of Ben. So now we have his information in the system. So this means that later on, when we're choosing beneficiaries and appointing trustees, then we're going to be able to select this individual. So that's the People tab. Any questions so far? Okay, then we'll go to Assets. So this is where you're going to list all of your clients' different assets. And so you can technically just add them all in and value them and give them a sense of what the net value of their estate is looking like at this point in time. But really for the will itself, the only assets that you need to add in here are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want to confirm or do new designations for in the will. You're always going to start with this general personal effects asset, and this is just to remind you to gift them to someone in the initial gift section in the scenarios so that you're triggering a special general personal effects clause coming up in the will. For any other assets, you just go to the Add button, you pick sort of your category and then your asset type, and then you can sort of enter the details of it. And what I like to do is change the asset name to however I want it identified throughout the system and in the will. So I like to put all the identifying information right in this asset name field because that's really the field that counts. So I'm going to call it the RBC bank account and then whatever the account number is. So that way, if I'm adding in multiple bank accounts, they're not just all going to be called bank account or bank account copy. It'll be, I'll know that this is the RBC bank account and the other one's the CIBC banking account and so on. You don't have to, but you can put a balance in and it'll make the graphic summary look a lot nicer. It'll also calculate the probate tax for you automatically according to whatever you've set the client's residency as. So here it's according to Ontario law. Next, let's go for real estate, home, So again, maybe they've got multiple homes. So this is the family home. You can change that asset name. For property, if you're gifting it specifically in the will, the address field will populate. So you can put that in there. Current value, let's say it's $1 million. Oops. So you also notice you have this mortgage/encumbrances field. So if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of that mortgage in this field right here. Because not only is it good to know sort of what asset the debt is associated with, but also it'll have an effect on how much probate tax is calculated for this asset. The next section is debts, and there also is opportunity to add a mortgage in there. But best practice is if it's associated with a specific asset that you're adding into the system, just add it in this field here and not as a separate debt on the debts tab. The one thing you want to make sure is that you're not adding it in both places because it will double count it. So best practice, just add it in here and not as a separate debt. You can also change the ownership, joint tenants in common. Let's say it's joint ownership with Warren. And let's do one more. We'll go for an RRSP. Again, I'm going to put all that identifying information on that first line, the asset name. The beneficiary, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy, and it's strictly for information purposes. So later on, you're going to be able to choose whether you want to confirm or do a new designation in the will. Current value, say it's 100,000. So you might notice that the probate tax always automatically calculates, but the income tax doesn't. And this is just due to the variability of different clients' tax bracket. So what we usually do is if we're trying to estimate sort of the highest possible tax that the asset could incur. So if it's something like income tax for an RSP, we'd put in like 50% of that. If it's something like an asset with a capital gain, we'd do like 25% of that gain. So that's the assets tab. Any questions here?
Yes,
No?
one question. If a person has royalties that are coming to them from either contracts with SOCAN or other contracts, where would you include that?
So you could add it as an asset in this system too. If it doesn't fit any of the categories specifically, you can just go under miscellaneous and just choose other and rename it to that.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. So then the next section is debts, and this is where you're going to put in any debts. It's really more for planning. So you just go to add debt. We're not going to put in a mortgage because we already added it in the assets tab and we don't want to double count it. But we can put in like a credit card. We can change the balance. Let's say it's 5,000 and we'll add that in. Then we get to scenarios, and this is really where all the planning occurs. And the idea is, depending on your client's situation, at most, you're going to plan for each of these 3 scenarios so that you're covering your bases no matter what happens. So there's kind of 2 ways you can go about doing this. You can do it manually by clicking into a scenario and going through each section. So in the joint designated assets section, this is where you're going to put things that are joint or designated to another individual to show that it's falling outside of the estate. Initial gifts, this is where you gift specific asset bequests or cash legacies. And then the balance of the estate, this is how you divide up the residue. And you can do this either by adding a segment and a gift within the segment, or by running a macro if it's sort of a more common residue breakdown and it matches one of our pre-populated macros. So you can do that, but if you're dealing with a typical client situation where it's like everything to spouse, everything to kids, instead of doing it manually from scratch, you can go up to this little lightning bolt button called ePlans. And these are like giant macros that go through the scenarios and appointments sections for you and create a plan depending on which one you select. And the great thing about it is, even if it doesn't match all the details or everything that you're wanting to do, it can give you a really good starting point so that You can run one of these and sort of work off of it so you're not starting from scratch. So I'm going to choose this last one. And now I can see I'm in the surviving spouse scenario still. Joint designated asset, it's given the RSP and the family home to the spouse to show that it's falling outside of the estate. Initial gifts, it's given the general personal effects to the spouse so that it generates that special general personal effects clause. And then the balance of the estate, it's created a segment to Lauren, absolute 100%. There's no gift over because that second scenario is the gift over, so we don't need to put anything here. But I don't even need to change anything in this scenario. This is exactly what I want to do. So I'll just go to the second scenario. So here there's nothing that's joint or designated. Initial gifts, we've got the general personal effects going to the children. If you had to do this manually, any specific asset bequest, you just drag and drop the green box, that's the asset. Then you choose your beneficiaries, either people, classes, or charities. I'm going to do the class of children. And then, since we're using the class of children, we now have this special distribution methods thing for general personal effects, where you can choose how you want the personal effects distributed. If you want it to be the trustee's discretion, if you want it to be as they agree, if it requires all of them to be alive or not. So you can sort of decide what distribution methods that you want now, and then you just click add. Then for the balance, we're going to click on segment 1 and children. So it's telling us that the residue is going to the children in a trust, 100%, same trustees as executors. I want it to be at 25 instead of 30. And then a staged lump sum at 21, I want it to be 25%. Unlimited discretion, gift over, first to beneficiaries issue, then to other class members. And then we'll save. So now I've not started from scratch, but I've ultimately ended up with the plan that I wanted to create, but it's just a faster way to do it. And if I made changes in Ben's and I also want those changes reflected in Lauren's descendants only scenario, I could sync up in the top corner. And so the sync is going to copy over the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two. The only thing it's not going to copy over are solely owned assets. So sometimes when you're going through the spouse's profile after and all of her planning, you might need to gift her general personal effects separately. Now we're in the last scenario. So technically I could just clear this and not even have a plan for this scenario. This is kind of an ultimate disaster. If I don't think it's ever going to get to this point, I don't necessarily have to create a plan. But let's say I want to create a plan. I'm going to give half to Jordy and half to Epilepsy Toronto. So I'll just click on this add segment, and I'm going to start with segment 1 for 50%. And I have to specify what's happening with this segment. So I'll do that by adding a gift. I'll pick Jordy. Absolute 100%. This means 100% of the 50% is going to go to Jordy. So I'm not dividing up this 50% any further. And let's say gift over to his issue. So now if I look at the green circles, I can see of this 50%, I've dealt with 100% of it. So I don't want to add any more gifts because I've already dealt with all of this. What I want to do is click on segments to go back to the segments and deal with my second segment for 50%. Then I'll add my gift. I'm going to do a charity. And then you can just type it in this box and it will search the CRA database for you. I'm going to do Epilepsy Toronto, absolute 100% add. So now I've got half going to the charity, half going to Jordan. And I can sync this over to Lauren as well. Any questions about the scenario section?
Hi, just a quick question. If you're dealing with a scenario where, for example, there's married spouse and 2 children, and one is over the age of 25, and let's say one is 21, in structuring it under the descendants scenario, the second one, would you recommend dealing with selecting a macro like you did, or creating two segments?
So you want to set up different trusts for the different kids?
Well, the first one wouldn't have a trust because they're over 25.
Right. So if you want to set up, there's kind of two ways you could do it. You can do it absolute and then have um the the younger one fall under the general trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. Or if you wanted to set up a specific trust for that individual, then I would, yeah, instead of running the macro, I'd probably create the two segments of
Mhm.
percent and give one absolute to the older child and then one trust for the younger child.
So a follow-up question to that, if you have two segments, how would you indicate that, let's say, let's say in this scenario with no descendants, you've indicated the segment one is to go to Jordy's issue. If he doesn't have issue, how would you spill it over to, I don't know, the charity, for example?
It'll be automatically done just through floating shares. You don't have to specify it to go to the other segment. It'll only create as many segments as necessary. So if Jordy and his issue weren't around, then it would all just go to the charity because only 50 parts would be created. So they would get 50 out of 50 instead of 50 out of 100.
I see. So the drafting provides for, if not, then fall into and form part out. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
no problem. So then we'll get to appointments. So there's two things here. There's estate trustees and guardians. Because we ran that e-plan, it's already made the spouse the primary estate trustee. To add anyone else, you just go to the add button. You can pick people or trust corporations. If you choose the trust corporation, their specific clauses will populate in the will. We're going to pick Jordy. And then the condition, this is depending on whether you want them as a primary or an alternate. So for primary, you're always going to pick none. That'll make them a primary. For alternate, you'll put a condition on it. And usually I pick if all is specified cannot act, and I make sure the person on the specified line is correct. So it's going to go Lauren if Lauren can't, Jordy. I could do a further alternate. I can pick John and condition if all specified cannot act. And then I'm just going to change the specified to Jordy. So now it's going to go Lauren if Lauren can't, Jordy if Jordy can't, John. And I can sync the estate trustees up in this top corner. Then we'll get to provisions. So there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can type them on the line. If not, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause. Include future members as if you're using class gifts in the will and you want to include future members of the class. So since we use the class of children in the will, if I check this box, it's going to say my children are John Collins and any other child born to or adopted by me and Lauren. So that if you're sort of planning for a young couple and they're likely to have more children, this is a good option. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is that general trust for underage beneficiaries. So usually it would apply in a gift over situation where you're not setting up the trust specifically in the will, but if it ultimately goes to an underage beneficiary, it'll fall under this general trust clause. And then the last thing is just secondary will assets. So if you're doing multiple wills, here's where you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, it's not going to have any effects. So you don't need to check or uncheck any boxes. Then up in the top corner, we have advisor insights. So these are kind of like little contextual alerts that help to advise you on things you might have missed and things that you should consider during the planning process, depending on your client's situation. Some of them will go away, like you forgot to put in a gender, you went back and you put in a gender, it would disappear. Some of them are always going to be here, like this request prior wills documents. The next thing is just notes. If you ever wanted to make notes on your client, you could do that here. And these notes will print out at the end of the text summary. And then this downward arrow button, this is where you generate all your documents and your summaries. So there's 3 summaries. the profile, which is going to give you all the information of the people, all the profile, assets, and debts. So it can be good to give to the client after the planning meeting so they can review and make sure all of these spelling of names and asset details are correct. The second one is the graphic scenario summary. So this is a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. It gives you a sense of what's going where, and if you're putting in values on the assets tab, it's sort of a lot nicer and it gives you sort of rough value of the state and what's going in each section. And then lastly, you've got the text scenario summary. So it's got all the information on everything you've done in the will, how you've broken it down, what gifts you've created, and how you've divided up the residue. It's like the will without the legalese. And then you can also do documents. You just click on documents. Today we're going to do single will. So you just check these two boxes. Signing date, you can change it or you can take it out completely. Registered asset designation, this is if you want to confirm or do new designations for the registered assets in the will. Joint designated asset confirmation is basically something that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. A will guide is sort of a chart at the end of the will that guides to the different clauses. And then a cover page is just a cover page. And you can choose witnesses as anyone else who's a user on your account, or you can just select this blank box and you can sort of manually put their information in later. And then you just click generate and it's going to give you a Word document. It's fully editable. You can make any changes you want. Here we've got funds and plans. This is because we checked the registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will because we checked the joint designated asset box. Here's our definitions and interpretations. Here's our appointments. So we've got Lauren, if not Lauren, Jordy, if not Jordy, John. Here's our funeral arrangement. Here's our special general personal effects. So we've got Lauren, if not Lauren, then we're going to give it to the children. Residue, Lauren, here's a trust for the children. And then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And if we scroll all the way down, we'll get to the will guide, which is a nice little guide to the different clauses in the will. So that's how you'd go through it. One other good resource to point out is this little question mark button. So if you click on that, it'll bring you over to our help desk where you've got lots of articles on how to do different things and also courses. So it's got specifically this estate planner certification course. And here's the link to the course. It's self-paced, it's free, and it'll really help you learn the software better. It'll take you through from start to finish and sort of teach you all the tips and tricks. But that about wraps it up for today. Are there any final questions about anything?
Yes, sorry. In terms of generating a draft document, let's say we prepared it and realized that the result is not, from our lack of, for example, familiarity with the system, the result is not what we intended and we need to make a correction and then go back and regenerate the document. Am I correct that the fee for the generation, I guess, is charged once, but if you regenerate it, it doesn't charge again?
Correct. So if the fees incurred if you're on the flex plan when you generate your first document or summary for that client, and then after that you can generate as many different versions, as many different documents for that client as you want.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, that about wraps it up. But if you do come across any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me directly or you can email support. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.